Picture this. You're a Spanish court physician in the year 1700, summoned to examine the newly crowned King Charles II. As you approach the royal chambers, whispers follow you down the marble corridors, whispers about the king's condition that no one dares speak aloud. When you finally see him, your medical training fails to prepare you for what lies before your eyes. The 20-year-old monarch can barely speak, his jaw so severely deformed that his tongue hangs uselessly from his mouth. His body is twisted, his mind operates at the level of a child, and his limbs shake with uncontrollable tremors. This is not the result of disease or accident. This is the inevitable consequence of 2 centuries of deliberate, systematic inbreeding within one of Europe's most powerful royal dynasties. What you're witnessing is the final grotesque culmination of the Habsburg family's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. For over 200 years, this dynasty had practiced something so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that it would eventually destroy them from within. They didn't just allow incest, they actively planned it, celebrated it, and turned it into the cornerstone of their political strategy. Brothers married sisters, uncles wed nieces, and cousins coupled with cousins in an endless cycle of genetic horror that would produce some of history's most deformed and mentally disabled rulers. But the true horror of the Habsburg story isn't just about the twisted relationships or the monstrous offspring they produced. It's about how an entire civilization watched this happen, participated in it, and even celebrated it as divinely ordained. The Habsburg incest plots weren't secret scandals hidden from public view. They were state ceremonies, blessed by the Catholic Church and praised by courtiers who understood that their survival depended on supporting these unnatural unions. Before diving into these forgotten stories of genetic horror and royal madness, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these disturbing historical realities together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darkest chapters of human civilization. The Habsburg dynasty began their reign of genetic terror in the early 1500s, when they controlled vast territories spanning from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to parts of Italy. They were, quite literally, the most powerful family in Europe, but with great power came a terrible paranoia, the fear that sharing their bloodline with outsiders would dilute their divine right to rule. This wasn't mere snobbery, it was a calculated strategy to maintain absolute control over their vast empire. The man who set this nightmare in motion was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled during the height of Habsburg power in the early 16th century. Charles wasn't particularly deformed. The worst genetic effects wouldn't become apparent for several generations, but he established the principles that would doom his dynasty. He believed with absolute conviction that Habsburg blood was sacred, chosen by God to rule over lesser mortals. Mixing this divine essence with the blood of other royal families, he reasoned, would be tantamount to blasphemy. Charles V's marriage to his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, seemed perfectly normal by the standards of European royalty. Royal cousins had been marrying for centuries as a way to forge political alliances and keep wealth within established families. But Charles took this practice to its logical extreme, decreeing that future Habsburg marriages should prioritize blood purity above all other considerations. He didn't just want his children to marry within the family, he wanted them to marry as closely within the family as possible. The results of Charles V's policies became apparent in the next generation. His son, Philip II of Spain, inherited not only vast territories, but also his father's obsession with bloodline purity. Philip's first marriage was to his cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, but she died in childbirth after producing a son, Don Carlos, who would become one of history's most disturbing examples of inbred royalty. Don Carlos was born with severe physical and mental disabilities that would plague him throughout his short, miserable life. But Philip II wasn't deterred by his son's obvious genetic problems. Instead, he interpreted them as divine tests of Habsburg faith. When Maria Manuela died, Philip married his aunt, his father's sister, Mary the of England. This wasn't just politically motivated, it was a deliberate choice to double down on the family's commitment to genetic isolation. When Mary died childless, Philip married Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, but only after careful genealogical analysis confirmed that she carried sufficient Habsburg blood through previous intermarriages. By the 1570s, the Habsburg approach to marriage had evolved into something that resembled a breeding program more than a series of romantic unions or political alliances. Court genealogists maintained detailed charts mapping the bloodlines of potential spouses, calculating the exact percentage of Habsburg blood each candidate possessed. These charts weren't just reference materials, they were sacred documents that determined the fate of empires. The most disturbing aspect of these genealogical calculations wasn't their scientific pretensions, but their complete disregard for the human consequences of extreme inbreeding. Court physicians had already begun documenting the physical and mental problems plaguing Habsburg children, but their reports were dismissed or suppressed. The family's commitment to blood purity had become a religious doctrine that couldn't be questioned without risking charges of heresy or treason. Philip II's son, Don Carlos, provided a horrifying preview of what generations of inbreeding would ultimately produce. Born in 1545, Carlos exhibited signs of severe mental illness from early childhood. He was prone to violent rages, during which he would attack servants, animals, and even members of his own family. His physical appearance was equally disturbing. He had a severely deformed spine, one leg shorter than the other, and a head so misshapen that specially designed hats were required to maintain the illusion of royal dignity. But Don Carlos's problems went beyond physical deformity and mental instability. He displayed what modern psychology would recognize as profound psychopathic tendencies. He tortured animals for pleasure, forced servants to engage in degrading acts for his amusement, and showed no capacity for empathy or normal human emotion. Court records, carefully sanitized for public consumption, still reveal glimpses of behavior so disturbing that his own father eventually had him imprisoned to prevent further scandals. The tragedy of Don Carlos wasn't just personal, it was dynastic. Here was the heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, rendered completely unfit to rule by the very breeding practices his family considered sacred. Philip II faced an impossible choice: acknowledge that Habsburg genetic policies had produced a monster, or maintain the fiction that Carlos was simply suffering from temporary illness that prayer and medical treatment could cure. Philip chose to maintain the fiction, but privately, he began making arrangements for Carlos to be removed from the line of succession. In 1568, Don Carlos died under mysterious circumstances while imprisoned in his quarters. Official records claimed he died of natural causes, but private correspondence suggests that Philip may have ordered his son's death to prevent him from ascending to the throne and exposing the full extent of Habsburg genetic deterioration. The death of Don Carlos should have served as a warning about the dangers of continued inbreeding, but instead it became a precedent for hiding the consequences of Habsburg genetic policies. Future generations would learn to conceal their deformities behind elaborate court protocols, to disguise their mental deficiencies through carefully scripted public appearances, and to eliminate family members who threatened to expose the dynasty's genetic secrets. Philip II's response to his son's genetic catastrophe wasn't to abandon inbreeding, it was to pursue it even more systematically. His subsequent marriages, and those arranged for his other children, followed the same pattern of prioritizing blood purity over genetic health. The Habsburg family had crossed a psychological threshold where admitting the failure of their breeding program would require acknowledging that their entire claim to divine rule was fraudulent. This psychological trap would ensnare every subsequent generation of Habsburgs, creating a dynasty that became increasingly isolated from genetic reality while maintaining public facades of imperial grandeur. Each generation would be more inbred than the last, each ruler more physically and mentally compromised, until the inevitable collapse that awaited them in 1700 with the pathetic figure of Charles II. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how the Habsburg dynasty reached such depths of genetic horror, we need to examine the specific marriages, the calculated decisions, and the systematic cover-ups that transformed European royalty into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and misguided ideology. The true acceleration of Habsburg genetic horror began with Philip III, who ascended to the Spanish throne in 1598. If his grandfather Charles V had planted the seeds of dynastic inbreeding, and his father Philip II had watered them with systematic genetic isolation, then Philip III would harvest the first truly catastrophic crop of deformed royalty. His marriage to Margaret of Austria wasn't just another cousin marriage. It was a union between two people who shared so many common ancestors that their family tree resembled a twisted knot rather than a branching structure. Margaret of Austria was Philip III's first cousin twice over, meaning they shared multiple sets of grandparents through different lineages. Their wedding ceremony in 1599 was celebrated throughout the Spanish Empire as a triumph of Habsburg blood purity, but court physicians privately documented the immediate consequences. Margaret suffered multiple miscarriages, and the children who survived birth exhibited increasingly severe physical abnormalities that could no longer be hidden from public view. Their son, who would become Philip IV, was born with the characteristic Habsburg jaw so severely pronounced that he couldn't properly chew food or speak clearly. Palace records describe elaborate systems developed to help the future king eat: special spoons, pre-cut foods, and even mechanical devices designed to assist with basic functions that normal children mastered naturally. But the physical deformities were only the beginning. Philip IV also displayed signs of what modern medicine would recognize as severe learning disabilities, requiring specially trained tutors who spent years teaching him basic skills that typical children acquired effortlessly. The Habsburg response to these mounting genetic disasters reveals the true depth of their delusion. Rather than recognizing the connection between inbreeding and deformity, court philosophers and theologians developed elaborate theories explaining why God was testing the dynasty with these challenges. They argued that the physical suffering of Habsburg rulers was actually evidence of their divine favor, that God was purifying their bloodline through trials that would ultimately strengthen their spiritual authority. This theological framework provided cover for even more extreme genetic experimentation. Philip IV's marriage to Elizabeth of France initially seemed to break the pattern of close inbreeding, but genealogical analysis reveals that Elizabeth carried substantial Habsburg blood through previous intermarriages. More disturbing still, Philip IV maintained a parallel breeding program through his illegitimate children, carefully monitoring which combinations of Habsburg genetics produced the most viable offspring. The systematic nature of Habsburg genetic manipulation extended far beyond royal marriages. Court records reveal detailed breeding charts tracking the fertility and health outcomes of various genetic combinations within the extended royal family. Cousins were matched with cousins, nieces with uncles, and even more distant relatives were evaluated for their genetic compatibility based entirely on the percentage of Habsburg blood they carried. By the 1640s, the Habsburg genetic experiment had produced a generation of royalty so physically and mentally compromised that governing became nearly impossible. Philip IV's children required constant medical attention, specialized equipment for basic functions, and carefully orchestrated public appearances designed to hide their deformities from foreign ambassadors and their own subjects. The elaborate court protocols that historians often interpret as excessive ceremony were actually desperate attempts to disguise the genetic collapse of Europe's most powerful dynasty. The final phase of Habsburg genetic horror culminated in the marriage arrangements for the future Charles II. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, a relationship so genetically concentrated that their offspring inherited multiple copies of every defective Habsburg gene accumulated over previous generations. Charles II represented the mathematical endpoint of dynastic inbreeding, carrying genetic damage so severe that survival itself became a daily struggle. When Charles VIII was born in 1661, court physicians immediately recognized that something unprecedented had occurred. The infant couldn't nurse properly, his limbs were twisted, and his head was so misshapen that special supports were required to prevent injury. But the most disturbing aspect of Charles II's condition wasn't visible. It was neurological. The centuries of Habsburg inbreeding had finally produced a ruler whose mental capacity was so severely compromised that he functioned at the level of a young child throughout his entire adult life. The cover-up surrounding Charles II's condition required unprecedented levels of court manipulation. Public appearances were carefully staged, with hidden supports helping him stand upright, and ventriloquist techniques used to create the illusion that he could speak coherently. Foreign ambassadors were briefed in advance about the king's eccentric mannerisms, while court artists were commissioned to create portraits that bore no resemblance to his actual appearance. Behind the elaborate facades and desperate cover-ups, the Habsburg dynasty was dying. Charles II's complete inability to produce an heir marked the genetic dead end of a family line that had once dominated European politics. His death in 1700 triggered the War of Spanish Succession, as other European powers moved to claim territories that the Habsburg genetic experiment could no longer govern effectively. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line serves as one of history's most comprehensive cautionary tales about the dangers of genetic isolation and the corrupting influence of absolute power. What began as a calculated strategy to maintain dynastic control evolved into a systematic program of genetic self-destruction that ultimately consumed the very empire it was designed to preserve. Today, modern genetic analysis of Habsburg remains confirms what court physicians could only suspect, that centuries of systematic inbreeding had created genetic damage so severe that the dynasty's extinction was mathematically inevitable. The Habsburg story reminds us that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that isolation breeds corruption, and that the most elaborate systems of control can become instruments of their creator's downfall. The twisted family trees, the deformed rulers, and the systematic cover-ups weren't just historical curiosities. They were the predictable consequences of a dynasty that confused genetic concentration with divine blessing. In their obsession with blood purity, the Habsburgs created their own genetic prison, and Charles II was both its final victim and the key that finally unlocked the door to their dynastic tomb.